Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for taking the time to join me tonight at this webinar. My name's Nick Hewlett, as I know you know, the head at St Dunstan's College, and it has been and remains my very great pleasure to lead St Dunstan's, and particularly so, I have to say, over the last year or so, with all of the additional challenges that the pandemic has brought to bear. And I hope very much that what I say tonight will, of course, be of interest, but I also hope that it makes us all think a little bit more about the impact of COVID-19 on our education system and what it has exposed. I also hope that you'll go on to have further conversations and discussions wherever you happen to be joining us from. There will be some time at the end for me to answer your questions. And if you want to ask a question throughout the course of the webinar, please do use the chat function. The way that will work is that it will be picked up by an administrator of the webinar, and they will then release those questions to me at the very end after I've finished speaking. So in a few moments, I'll begin the presentation. So the purpose of this webinar is to capture reflections on what has, without doubt, been the biggest interruption to our education system since the Second World War. And as with any interruption to any system or process, it has inevitably led to many of us questioning the status quo and bringing questions to the fore. And these aren't necessarily new questions or new tensions. Indeed, they've been simmering away under the surface for many years, but they are questions that have, without doubt, been elevated in our thinking as a consequence of the reset button that has been pressed by COVID-19 on all of our educational thinking. And I do think our educational thinking needs to evolve, and it needs to see this pandemic as an opportunity to ask important questions of our priorities as a society and how and why we are educating our future generations in the way that we are. And it's certainly true to say that we have had fundamental change forced upon our educational system, the likes of which the vast majority of us have never seen before. Number one, for the first time in decades, we have had no public examinations for 2 years running now. No examinations, no league tables, no objectively and externally verified attainment data, and yet we have all survived. Number two, we have had technological advances forced upon us at a speed that is simply unprecedented, and we have had no choice but to adapt. Number three, we have had children remain cooped up in their homes and deprived of the person-to-person, human-to-human social interaction of on-site schooling. And number four, the gulf between resourcing in different school systems has been laid bare like never before. Those who have been able to provide the necessary technology with relative ease, as against those for whom it has been virtually impossible. And these fundamental changes have forced many of us to ask challenging questions of our education system. Why it is as it is, how it might change for the better, and in such an unknown and uncertain world, is our current system cultivating what our future society needs in order to thrive? And I will argue in this presentation that the pandemic has exposed our educational thinking as having been on a treadmill of complacency, one that has refused to see the real value in education for broader social good, one that has been afraid of change as a consequence of deep-seated conservative values that root our profession into a relentless bun fight for grades and competitive advantage, to the detriment of developing wholesome, healthy young people who can think differently, be tenacious, self-aware, empathetic, and cultured. I will argue that education has become all about filling the pail of knowledge and increasingly not about lighting fires of imagination. I'm going to consider three fundamental questions. Number one, what is the purpose of education and should our priorities be changing? Number two, has the technological change forced upon us as a consequence of the pandemic forever changed the way that we deliver our education? And number three, what role should independent schools be taking in a post-COVID Britain? So let's move on to the first of those questions. What is the purpose of education and should our priorities be changing? And for me, this is the nub of so many of the current controversies around our educational system. We seem to find it impossible to agree the actual purpose of education. There has developed a central tension to what we are trying to achieve, a tension between a purpose that exists to feed a system of perceived competitive economic advantage, i.e., I choose the school for my child where I think he or she is going to get the best grades, go to the best university, and by doing this get the best job, make lots of money, and contribute effectively to the economic system, as against the view that education actually has a broader ethical and cultural purpose for the betterment of humanity, that it exists to develop young men and young women who are able to live more reflectively, more empathetically, and more knowledgeably about the range of human sentiment. An argument may be between social good and personal gain. And I actually don't think the two things are mutually exclusive, but they have been allowed to develop as such. The conflict in purpose has changed a great deal over time. The ancient world held a very different prevailing view when it came to the purpose of their education. This classic Roman saying, mens sana in corpore sano, a healthy mind in a healthy body, says it all. For the Romans, central to the betterment of society has to be the health of the individual, the betterment of the individual's well-being and their rounded appreciation of the richness of a human experience. The Roman phrase artis liberalis exemplifies it further, the arts worthy of a free man. The worthiness of the arts, where do you see that in education today? And it wasn't just the Romans. The ancient Greeks devised a broad, fulfilling curriculum of grammar, logic, and rhetoric, which sat within the teachings of geometry, arithmetic, music, and astronomy. It was Plato who said, I would teach young people physics, philosophy, and music, but above all else music, for the rubric and structures of music form the foundations of all good learning. Very different way of looking at things. Likewise, in the Renaissance and 15th century Europe, scholars placed far more of an emphasis on the importance of creativity and understanding worldly, secular feelings and sensations. These humanist educators celebrated art, literature, architecture, and designed teaching methods deliberately to prepare well-rounded, liberally educated people. Erasmus believed that understanding and conversing about the meaning of literature was far more important than memorizing it, which was radical at the time because that was what had been required of the then medieval religious schools. He advised teachers to study fields as diverse as archaeology, astronomy, mythology, poetry, and ethics, as he saw this as the route to achieving the best possible understanding of the world and the feelings and people that inhabit it. I'm afraid it was the religious reformation of the 16th century that marked the changes to education in a way that really began to limit its breadth and creativity. Protestant religious reformers were keen to establish schools that offered a basic curriculum of reading, writing, arithmetic, and religion for all children. And so, frankly, it continued. And we've seen the ebbs and flows ever since. Actually, it was at my school at St Dunstan's where we really challenged the norm back in 1888. A very narrow curriculum was predominating in late 19th century Britain, with the classics and religion dominating curricular thinking in the great public schools of the day. And it was us, we introduced engineering, technology and science, one of the very first schools in the country and possibly the world to have done so, radically breaking with tradition. But with that more liberal approach came something even more interesting, the whole concept of heuristic education. That is, that the finding out is more important than the knowing. And the first head of St Dunstan said it's not so much what a child knows that is important, but how he finds it out, which, if you think about it, for 1888 is truly extraordinary. But the fact here is that when you broaden the curriculum, you broaden the mind and the way it operates. So we get back to the here and now. And it really was from the 1980s onwards that we embarked on a persistent trajectory of narrowing the curriculum. Of late, a lot of this has focused on the unabated directive for testing and assessment. And once this culture sets in, there's something of an inevitability to the narrowing. The first subjects that go in this culture are, of course, the creative arts. What's the point in them? A nice extra, but outside of our primary objective, to teach to the tests that ultimately, in the word of Grayling, produce foot soldiers in the economic struggle for competitive advantage. And we've seen this tragic trend run wild in our state education system, in particular, the EBAC, of course, recently conspicuously lacking any recognition of the creative arts as core subjects at all. But what this further engenders is an obsession with knowledge-based curricula. Because what is the easiest way to objectively test children in that culture? Well, it's through the packaging of knowledge into neat parcels ready for memorization and regurgitation. And we've seen our GCSEs head in this direction for 20 years. It's become far less about rhetoric, creative thinking, evaluation and judgment. And I'm not just talking, by the way, about the creative arts here. The whole way we approach the teaching of science and maths, it's become not about how we think, but far more about how many equations, quotes and facts can be committed to memory before being spewed out onto an exam room floor for what is increasingly now, by the way, computers to mark. And this automation of the whole examination and assessment process compounds the problem even further, because with computers unable to make subjective judgments over the quality of written responses, the subtleties of interpretation, the imaginative analysis of a problem, the whole system inevitably ever marches towards a more binary, easily packaged tool of assessment of knowledge. And what does that mean? Well, it in turn means that teachers inevitably become increasingly obsessed with teaching to the test, and schools judged on attainment data that we all know is primarily driven by selection criteria anyway of those children who are more inherently able to fill the pail of knowledge memorization. Once again, filling the pail as a system and not lighting the fires, because this is how society judges them and how it judges schools. I would argue strongly that there are significant problems with this current trend. Firstly, in its broadest possible terms, it leads to the decimation of civil society. Aristotle said that we educate ourselves so that we can make noble use of our leisure. And I really think there's something in this. It's how we can take noble choices about how we live our lives that must surely be of paramount importance going forwards. A cultured understanding of self and others, developing young people who are at one with themselves and have a broader ethical understanding of the world. Young people who flourish and affect the flourishing of others through the development of their whole character. And this is where liberal education is so important, each subject being of equal importance, enabling us to live more reflectively and knowledgeably about the range of human experience, developing sentiment and a broader sense of character. And what is even more extraordinary is that all the trends we read about and we see are that there is a practical and tangible need for this approach more than ever before. If we start by looking at the adolescent mental health crisis, I know that many of you don't need to be reminded of these worrying statistics, but the reality of the picture is that our children in Britain have amongst the lowest life satisfaction of any children in Europe. And all the evidence suggests it is getting even worse as a consequence of this pandemic. But let's try to understand the root cause of why this is. I'm absolutely convinced that the answer lies in large part as a consequence of the immense pressure we place on children in this country to succeed through relentless forms of assessment. Alongside this is the concurrent starvation of creativity, both in how our knowledge-heavy curriculum is taught, but also in the proactive and overt stripping back of creative subjects. And yet, our future workplace needs young people who are happy, who are content with themselves and one another. More than that, in an increasingly globalized world with diverse communities and diverse identities, we need open-minded, compassionate and empathetic members of a future workforce, not coiled springs of insecurity who have managed to memorize the key quotes of Twelfth Night and the equations of relative motion. And if this is not enough, we might also do well to listen to the employers. IBM conducted a 2010 study of global CEOs, and they concluded that creativity is now the most important leadership quality for success in business, outweighing even integrity and global thinking. And furthermore, we know that the trend in business is to screen less on the outcomes of knowledge-based assessment. In 2017, Grant Thornton stopped its whole process for screening graduate applications on the basis of firsts and 2-1s, for example. In fact, this is even more shocking, it found that on further investigation, there was an inverse relationship between poor degrees and high flyers in their organisation. And across the business community, HEPI have shown a persistent and dramatic reduction of all grade screening as part of recruitment policy. Why? Because employers are starting to look far beyond the test. Furthermore, what are we training children to access anyway? Although statistics like the one you're looking at are questionable, the reality is that we know we're preparing young people for an unknown workplace. And it's the transferable skills that are going to get them there. Now, none of this means that I don't believe in children having an academically rigorous education where they can excel in academic subjects. I absolutely do. And of course, they are an important part of a broader picture of success. The knowledge and skills that those qualifications represent do help employers and society form a judgment over our individual ability and values. And I'm not suggesting that we move to some sort of woolly utopian education model that doesn't offer any form of assessment or doesn't acknowledge that we live in a competitive world where competition is a fact of life. But I do think it needs to be redressed. I fundamentally challenge the purpose of GCSEs as a construct. They were introduced at a totally different time when children routinely left of school at 16, and that is just no longer the case. And I do think we need to look at the nature of assessment across the whole pupil journey and why we are assessing what we are in the way we are when we are. For example, why is it that we have an education system where a student can opt to write their final essay at the age of 16? That feels utterly wrong to me. And why are our schools not teaching fundamental life skills, economic education, conflict resolution, how to present ideas, critical thinking, all of that alongside a knowledge-rich curriculum? David Eastwood, Vice-Chancellor of Birmingham University, when he was reflecting on the possible move away from GCSEs and A-levels as they currently stand, which he is a great advocate for, he summed it up like this: pupil understanding would be greater, their range of skills and competence richer. And I have to say, I totally agree with that sentiment. But I suppose my broader point is that I do not think that a knowledge-rich curriculum and assessment model needs to be at the exclusion of a broad liberal education. The latter does not need to lead to lower academic outcomes. In fact, that is categorically not the case. In my view, it just leads to better adjusted children with a better, stronger sense of self and skills that will equip them for the future. At St Dunstan's, at my school, we have a deliberately strong Renaissance education, 17 subjects all the way through year 7, year 8, year 9, no drops. And yet we have some of the highest value added in the sector for our GCSEs and A-levels. Well-rounded, grounded children who know their stuff are academically ambitious, can be competitive when they need to be, absolutely, but none of it without grace and humanity, and without them being fully equipped to manage the vagaries of life and an unpredictable and uncertain future. So I move on to my second question, and please don't worry, these last two are far shorter than the first, but they feed the same principles that I've argued so far. And this one, of course, looks at the question of technology. There is no doubt that COVID-19 has been a game changer in our relationship with technology. Most schools have had to bring forward their strategic IT plans by several years in order to respond to the necessities of home learning. Some have acted quicker than others, but all have, in the end, realised that it can be done, and it can be done relatively successfully with a bit of tenacity and creativity. I suspect that the pandemic will have triggered something of a paradigm shift in the use of technology in education. And let's be honest, this has needed to happen. It has been the reboot that the sector needed. In no other sector of work or business has there been such lethargy in adopting technological advances for the betterment of the main output from the product. I suspect partly that has come from the perceived threat that technology poses to teachers. And this really goes back to my first point, because when you have a curriculum that's driven by knowledge-based learning and assessment, the role of the teacher has to become the fount of all knowledge, the great classroom performer. I would argue that a role such as this can't help but largely serve the purpose of filling the pail. And in many ways, of course, through no fault of their own, but as a consequence of the system they inhabit, as I've explained earlier. But in a future world where schools embrace technology, things will change. Where the best way for a student to learn about Roman Britain is to step into a VR world and speak with the Romans themselves, or where artificial intelligence breaks down complex algorithms and explains it to a young person that is inherently more logical to their mind than we could possibly conceive of, or where school-to-school collaboration allows for peer groups to learn from one another from Cairo to Catford, or when biometrics allows young people to see how the adrenaline is changing in their own bodies. All of this leads to a rapid acceleration in the assimilation of knowledge in a way never known before. So what then of the teacher? Well, the teacher then becomes something even more exciting, in my view, because they play an even more fundamental part in a young person's story. They become the conductor of the orchestra of knowledge, rather than the virtuoso violinist. They make links and connections. They ask young people to challenge convention. They change the tempo and dynamic of the classroom. They ask pupils difficult questions of themselves and others. They ask them to evaluate, to forge opinions, to debate, to be imaginative. They become the true champions of a character-driven, values-based, liberal education that should underpin knowledge and not be seen as the icing on the top of a knowledge-based curriculum. Technology forces us to ask even more questions of our current educational conveyor belt. And could all of this not be done just as well from home? Well, it could, and in some cases it will, and in some cases it will be helpful. But the pandemic has taught us something else too. Children desperately need face-to-face contact. Humans need humans and human interaction. And it's ironic that the very thing that has saved us through this pandemic is also one of the greatest threats. The beauty of technology needs to be managed alongside the beauty of life without it. For the young, the immediacy of data and of information presents enormous opportunity for the acceleration of knowledge assimilation, but it also presents a threat. The perfection of imagery and stereotyping for the young, the immediacy of communication, all of this has led to enormous challenge that has been compounded by the lockdown as the young have increasingly used this as a tool to hang on to. It has not been able to offset it against playing football on a Saturday, or by going round to a friend's house, or by going for a cycle ride. It has become even more the ever-present psychological crutch for this generation, the escapism, the creative outlet, and this is very worrying. Technology creates huge advantages, particularly in the acquisition and the facilitation of knowledge, but it cannot, in my view, it should not, and I very much hope it will not, overtake the essential role of social interaction. Ask the children whether they want to come back to school. Ask the children whether technology will replace their teachers. I have a strong belief in what they will say, because I believe that humanity values humanity more than ever, and that the virtual school will be something powerful that sits in second place to actual school, where we can all mix with one another, young and old, and learn from one another in creative and humane ways, driving forward an agenda for a truly liberal education, with technology liberating us to do so. And then finally, what role should independent schools take in post-COVID Britain? Well, if you believe in free market principles, I believe there will be a place for independent schools in the long term, while state education is funded in the way that it is. Because, of course, while I wax lyrical about the benefits of a broad curriculum, the truth is that the state sector has been starved of appropriate funding for so long that it has no choice but to cut back where it can. Subjects just have to go. And in the current system of assessment and school judgment, I quite understand why it has felt, in many cases, it has had no option but to trim back, in particular, the creative subjects, to relegate music, art and drama to a second division of optional extras. But here is where I believe independent schools do and must have a great and greater role to play. Rather than acting as bastions of privilege, they should, in my view, and must act as catalysts and facilitators for the redistribution of resource within their means. As charitable entities, they should be doing more than providing handouts to their neighbouring state schools and charities, but should be working in genuine partnership with them, sharing the skills and talents and specialisms on both sides to help all young people develop the libertarian principles and character that I've espoused today. Genuine two-way partnerships that engender a greater sense of social cohesion and a greater social good. A post-pandemic world will require social healing like never known before, and it will require partnership and the fostering of meaningful relationships across sectors. And this is the only role I see for our great charitable institutions going forward. I think the future will see two types of independent schools. There will be those who rise and embrace that opportunity for partnerships and their role in shaping community evolution and genuine social good. And then there will be those who will continue to be inward looking, who feel threatened by some sort of broader role, who see their role as producing the carbon copy graduates we have seen for years in this country, who are locked into a competitive economic system that is so prioritised in their thinking and their lived educational experience that they can't see that the future of this country and of the world rests in a shared appreciation of humanity and libertarian principles. And all of this leads me to conclude that as we enter what does now seem to be the final stretch of the tunnel, with some clear light at the end, that we should use this whole ghastly experience to reflect and to reform, to ask ourselves what we are trying to achieve today through education in 21st century Britain. What I'm saying is not new. The head of Loreto famously said in the 19th century, when asked about his priorities for the school, first character, second physique, third intelligence, fourth manners, fifth information. but we need to act. And I would argue that radical change is necessary if we are going to engender a future society that, in my view, is fit for purpose. For ultimately, as Grayling says, liberal education is what makes civil society possible. Thanks for listening. And at this point, I imagine that Jordan, who is behind the scenes, has got a number of questions that he wants to pass through to me, which I'm more than happy to take. So I've got a question through here. How do you propose that schools support young people to re-immerse themselves in the school environment on their return? Sorry, if Jordan, if you could just stop sending them through for a minute, because I'm losing my way in reading out the questions. Let me just find that one again. Okay, here we are. Right, in a society with ever accelerating technology, changing at rates humans aren't equipped to adapt to, how important is it to teach more technical subjects and more about learning to learn that is often not discovered until late in university life? I mean, I think it's absolutely essential, and it's the crux of the problem. And if you think St Dunstan's back in 1888 was championing this whole heuristic approach, we don't even use heuristic education in our language, in our educational language anymore. It's sort of fallen away, which tells you everything. You know, the whole purpose of teaching and the whole purpose of learning is not to tell children what they need to know, but it is how to enable them to find out, to find their own way, to find answers, to work their way through complexity and to work their way through challenge. So I think we need to fundamentally redress what we're emphasizing in training, in the training of teachers, but you can't do that until you change the system. And whilst you still have a narrow, information-driven, knowledge-driven, packaged, increasingly automated GCSE assessment system, how can you possibly expect teachers to do anything other than package that knowledge and sort of jam it down children's throats, ready for the exam room? I mean, that's the system that we've created. So until that whole process is reformed, and my view is very firmly that the easiest way to reform that immediately is to get rid of the construct of GCSEs. I see absolutely no purpose for them. I mean, you can have some form of standardized assessment that happens all the way through that journey, but you need to liberate teachers to become those facilitators of heuristic education and not just the great knowledge suppliers. So I absolutely think that needs to come in increasingly in teaching. And in terms of technical subjects, I mean, this is technical and creative subjects. This is the area that I worry about the most. I mean, we again, I'm going to go back to my last point about independent schools. I mean, we are fortunate that we can resource a 17-strong curriculum where every child studies design engineering, the 3 separate sciences, computer science, art, music, drama. Every week they get lessons in those subjects all the way through that early adolescence. And I think that is absolutely imperative for the development of a young person. Imperative that they have that broad education until, well, in our case, of course, we're now forced at the age of 14, 15 to move them onto this GCSE conveyor belt, which is, as I've already said, I think is a great shame. But at least in that early part of adolescence, they should be entitled to do it. But the problem is that the schools are under-resourced, the state sector schools are under-resourced and able to do it. I've got another question here through, sorry if I'm picking these all out of order. How do you propose that schools support young people to re-immerse themselves in the school environment on their return next month? I mean, it's a really interesting point, and it's something that all schools across the country are going to be really battling with over these next few days as they're planning for it. I mean, I tell you what I've already said at my school, which is that when those kids come back the week beginning the 8th, the very last thing that we as educators or they as children should be experiencing is them coming back into the classroom and being hit with knowledge, tests, or any form of formal educational structure until they have at least first had the opportunity to speak with one another, to enjoy each other's company, to enjoy the company of the teacher, to reflect, yes, absolutely, to reflect on some of the learning that they've been enjoying remotely, but certainly not to try and engender us going back onto some sort of knowledge-based conveyor belt at that point. We need to look so carefully at ensuring those children become back into school and are well adjusted into whatever school setting they are going back into. How do you maintain breadth in your curriculum at GCSE and sixth form while still getting great value added? Well, I just don't see those two things as mutually exclusive. I don't see the evidence for it. So I can only base it on the experience that I've had. We don't have a drop-in culture in year 7, 8 and 9 at all. So they have to study all of those subjects. And then they do a 2-year GCSE course where they end up getting value added of half to 3/4 of a grade, that sort of level, which is, for those who are educationists will know, is very, very strong. So I think the reason for that is that because of the broad liberal education, they have the right skill set to be able to really thrive in independent study. So I don't see the two things as being mutually exclusive. In fact, if anything, I think that a grounding in a broad liberal education in early adolescence actually just better equips you to outperform when it comes to these examination systems. So I base it on evidence, and I base it on my sort of instinctive thoughts. That is, if you have a broad-minded approach and a broad immersion in that educational experience, you will have the toolkit to succeed. I mean, one of the things that worries me greatly in a lot of schools is this very early pigeonholing of children into a particular way of thinking educationally, particularly over their interests. You know, how many schools are there out there that really allow a child to be a wonderful rugby player and at the same time to enjoy singing in the chapel choir or dancing in a school musical or taking their chess club to the next level, but also playing sport on the weekend and being very successful at it? It's very unusual to find schools. I have to say, particularly in the independent set, it's very unusual to find schools that really exemplify that Renaissance approach and that breadth of skill set. And I think the reason for that is because the nature of the whole education system is geared up towards narrowing identities. We seem obsessed in schools, in far too many schools, of pigeonholing people's identities earlier and earlier and earlier. Okay, you're this type of person, so you're going to go and follow this pathway, or you're this type of person, so you're going to go and follow this pathway. That's not what school's about. School's about having multiple pathways in front of you, to go down one route and then to change your mind and go on to another route and try something else and keep up that breadth of opportunity and that breadth of experience. That's what school is about. And we see the whole system seems to have just sort of almost, the walls have come into this narrowing of identity, narrowing of curriculum, into stifling young people. And there's a large part of that, I think, that fuels the mental health pandemic that we've got at the moment amongst young people, because they can't just liberate themselves from the assessment process. They can't liberate themselves from a narrow knowledge-driven curriculum. They can't just enjoy the richness of learning across all those subjects for the sake of it. That's what education should be about, certainly in early adolescence, certainly, and I would argue even further than that. Sorry, I'm going to keep going here. Yeah, so there's a question here about schools who struggle, who may start to struggle if they don't adapt quickly to the sort of changes that I'm suggesting. Yeah, I mean, I do. I think they really will struggle, because I think ultimately what will start to emerge in the data is that actually what we thought was really strong education actually isn't fit for purpose. I mean, take that very interesting statistic about the 2 1s and firsts and the inverse relationship between success in industry. I mean, it's a fascinating emerging trend, as is this reduction in exam screening. I mean, my reticence about speaking to you about it is because, of course, I do believe in strong results, and I do believe in getting very strong results. But at the same time, we do have to look at what the future holds for our young people and what skills they require. And if our future unknown jobs market, where 80% or whatever of the jobs don't exist anymore, and we're trying to develop young people for a complete unknown. If they're saying to us, actually, what you really want to do is develop young people who can think differently, can think creatively, can work their way through problems imaginatively, who don't give up, who are tenacious and strong-willed, but at the same time empathetic and humble. If that's what we should be developing, then why is our educational system not rooted around those values? If we believe that education is the purpose of education is to have a fulfilling and a wholesome life, which I imagine that we do, akin to that being also employment, if that's the skill set that they're looking for, surely our education system should be rooted around that, would be my view. It's exciting, moving on to the next question that's been sent through to me. It's exciting to hear that something wonderful might emerge from this in terms of education, but how can we ensure that the conveyor belt won't just restart? Yeah, I mean, I've had this conversation with others about what will actually happen in post-COVID Britain educationally, and I'm afraid my fear is that we will just resort to type, that schools will resort to type, that politicians involved in education will just resort to the easy option, which is let's just carry on with GCSEs and change the grading a bit, or make it a bit more rigorous, which just means, you know, learn a few more equations. That's my honest worry. But I can say one area where I think it will change, where I don't think the conveyor belt will start again, and that's the role of independent schools in being more invested in local communities and more invested in society and social good. I absolutely don't think a post-COVID Britain will put up with any sense of anything other than the fact that independent schools, with their rich history and their resourcing, should play a central role in society's development, social healing and social mobility that's desperately needed in this country. And I don't think it will wash if they don't do that. So I think that will definitely change. Will everyone start to rush away from GCSEs and start to see the bigger picture of a kind of a humanity rooted in a civil, broad, liberal education? I suspect not. But there is a growing trend of people who are increasingly dissatisfied with the nature of our education system. One of the problems, of course, that we have is that the people who are setting our educational policy are not teachers. They're not educators. Again, this is where it's wrong. My own view is that we should have some sort of guild of educators, guild of teachers, who are advising as an advisory body to the government to really try and think through the decisions that are being taken. We don't have that. I mean, could you imagine if the whole coronavirus pandemic was just you know, Matt Hancock thinking it was a good idea? Or, you know, I mean, it wouldn't work. You need a panel of experts, you need a panel of scientists, well, you need a panel of educators who are helping guide government. But there's something about education. We saw it with Michael Gove, we've seen it many, many times before, where because of their own educational experience, I think they feel like they have a real sort of lens, a real understanding of what great education is, or what great education should look like, where we don't see that in any other sector. We don't see people saying, well, I know what a really good doctor looks like, even though I'm not qualified to be a doctor. But we see it in education. It's a very strange thing. I think it's rooted in people's own success stories in education. They feel so proud of that success story, and therefore they exemplify it through their sort of political work. Another really interesting question here, more about St Dunstan's and what we're intending to do. We're in some really interesting talks at the moment, looking at partnerships. I think there's all, as you'll probably be aware, north of the river, there's already quite a lot of very good work looking at sponsorship between independent schools and very high achieving selective state academies, which I think is great. And I mean, I'm a governor of one, and I think it's amazing what's going on there, and it's fantastic. I do think there is a need to look at the other end of the spectrum, and actually how are independent schools really supporting those children for whom school is increasingly not becoming an option at all, alternative provision schools, which are woefully underfunded. How are independent schools investing in those schools? And my goodness, independent school teaching could learn a lot from the teachers and educators who are working in some of those schools in terms of craft, management of teaching classrooms. I mean, you could learn an awful lot, and likewise the other way around in terms of the resource that we could give. But I worry that there's a sort of model out there, which is that the best way that independent schools can help is purely through helping those with those through a sort of social mobility agenda and through those who are particularly able, which I think is good. I don't get me wrong, I absolutely think it's good. And as I say, the work of those academies is fantastic. But I do think there is a need for partnerships that represent something a little bit different. I also think that the way we bring together higher education establishments with secondary schools and how we sort of facilitate that through independent school resource and networks is also very important and something that should be looked at. I'm not sure that we have got that triangulation right yet between higher education, secondary schools, both in the independent and the state sector, and I think there's something that could be really, really clever that's done with that arrangement, because again, it's about asking the universities, well, what form of assessment do you want? What sort of students do you want? What they want are students who are going to go on and make a success of their courses. Are they getting that, and why? And I think there's a dialogue there that could be very, very helpful indeed. Yeah, thank you. Another question here about other countries and where they're getting it right. I mean, there are lots of interesting models out there. If you look particularly at the Scandinavian models, for example, which I've been looking at recently, and actually there's elements of the Australian model as well, which I like a lot, and also elements of the assessment process in the American system too, which I think we could learn an awful lot from, particularly over that breadth. I mean, the Americans can't believe that we do three or in most cases 3 A levels post 16. My whole point about a child can write their final essay at 16. Well, because in this country they can choose to do maths, further maths and physics, and that's it from 16 to 18. That doesn't feel right to me. It really doesn't. I feel like that a child from 16 to 18 in what is a very important period of their life ought to be writing in prose and understanding the importance of that skill. And the Americans, as I say, I mean, are absolutely all over that. So I agree. I mean, the other point, of course, is that of the leading European countries, we are the only one that still has a GCSE system of the nature that we do. That post-16 assessment works in a very, very different way. If you look at how France deals with it, how Italy deals with it, very, very different from this, what I would call an extraordinary system of assessment at 16. So I think for us as a country, it's about looking at all of the different models and drawing and teasing out the best bits of so many of them, because there is lots to learn. And just before I sort of finish on this point, that's not to say that there's not really good things about the English education system. I mean, it's a hugely exportable asset for us as a nation. We know it's hugely in demand, and we know there's loads of things that we get right and to be cherished. And I haven't really emphasised those in this presentation, but there are a lot of schools who are doing really, really fantastic things. And look particularly at my sort of state school friends who, despite those budgetary constraints, are offering amazing programs in the creative arts, wonderful music and instrumental programs, and ensuring that really continues to flourish against all of the obstacles. And the whole premise of British education, I mean, going back to my earlier points in the presentation, was all exactly about those liberal principles that I've been talking about throughout the course of this presentation. That's what we were always about, and the best of us retains that. I suppose my point is that I worry about this gravitational shift towards something far more sterile, and I think we need to claw it back, get back to where we were, offering this really rich education, which will enable our young men and young women to go out into the globalized world of which they're going to be a part, into jobs that we don't know really of their nature, and to be able to thrive through the values and characteristics that we've allowed them to develop in our schools, rather than them going out into the workplace being crippled by this sort of competitive zeal that means that that any sense of failure is greeted with utter confusion and bafflement, and they can't cope with it, which I've seen time and time again, where you take really, really able students who go through, ace all of their exams, go off to Oxford and Cambridge, do really well, go into the workplace, and suddenly they realise that actually life's a bit harder than that, more complex than that. Work changes, life's difficult, and it's challenging. They can't cope with it. So we have to go back to saying, yes, we've got wonderful knowledge-driven curricula, which much of which we really like, that we really value. That we've got wonderful, esteemed higher education establishments we really value, but actually we need to make sure that our foundations are right. And I would argue that the foundations are rooted in that values-driven curriculum. Do you see technology extending to partnerships with schools globally, giving children the opportunity to engage with different cultures beyond the boundaries of the UK? I absolutely do, and I think that will be one of the quickest changes in the technology revolution that or the technology legacy, I should say, that happens after this pandemic, because it's so easy, and every school in the world is having to adjust in one way or another. Zoom is a global colloquial language, and so the ability for us, I mean, I think about our own situation. We have a partnership with a very successful school in Delhi in India, and the ability for us to just have joint classrooms and those children working with one another on projects, I mean, it's just a no-brainer. It frankly makes you think, why on earth didn't we do that previously? Which is my point about us catching up with technology. So I absolutely think that there is scope for that. I'll take one or two more questions and then I'll round things up. So one change that I would make in the school post-pandemic. It's a really good question. There are a number of changes that I would make, but if I were to just take a couple, if I may. I mean, the first one that I would make is I think a root and branch review needs to be done of technology in schools and technology in my school. And by root and branch review, we need to unpack and articulate and understand the huge benefits that technology will bestow on our children, on our teaching, the way I talked about the ability for it to liberate teaching in the way that it might be, we know it will be able to do, the way that it will be able to really accelerate the acquisition of knowledge amongst the young, the way they'll be able to immerse in different cultures and experiences. We need to really articulate and understand that and have a strategy for that. But on the flip side, we also need to really understand the threat of technology for these young people, and I would argue the accelerated threat that has happened as a consequence of this pandemic. The gaming spectre that I imagine many of you are dealing with at the moment at home, which has taken over the lives of so many young people at home in this pandemic. It has become their psychological crutch. The role of social media, that when moderated and when ground rules are agreed with young people and we get them to buy into those ground rules, can be really healthy, but it can also be incredibly destructive. So I think there needs to be this root and branch review of saying, look, technology has been imposed upon us, forced upon us in a way that we never could have conceived. What does that landscape look like? How are we going to work our way through that? Looking at it from a risk perspective, looking at it from an opportunity perspective. How are we going to map that through, articulate that, and build an ambitious, forward-thinking strategy for the role of technology in enhancing those values, those liberal values of education that I've been talking about today? I think that would probably be the single biggest change. I also think there is a piece of work to be done urgently, going back to the person who asked me an earlier question about the extent of the mental health damage that has been done on the young people in this country as a consequence of the pandemic. I think we are only scratching the, sorry to scare you, but I honestly think we are only scratching the surface in terms of the impact that it has done. And a piece of work must be done to look at all of those processes, those systems, all of those things that really good schools have in place for proactive pastoral care, not reactive pastoral care, proactive pastoral care, and to ensure that we are doing everything possible to facilitate them getting back to healthy routines, normalised social routines that enable them to make the very most of the kind of education I'm offering. And here's my last question, I think. So plan for the worst, hope for the best. How would a third wave of COVID-19 impact the wider education system, and how would you mitigate this? Look, I mean, my goodness, it would be incredibly worrying if that were to happen, because the only outcome that I can really foresee, were that to happen, is for us to resort back to the technology and the remote learning package that we put in place now more or less a year ago. You know, I'm very, very proud and pleased that St Dunstan's acted so quickly to put together such a robust programme of remote learning. And you know, our children have been served well by it. You know, they've been able to access remote lessons and in all sorts of different ways. It's been very good, but my goodness, it has not been the same as being on school. And you know, anyone who tells you otherwise is just not telling you the truth. The impact on those young people being stuck at home with their parents for all that time, unable to go and meet their friends and socialise. Well, I'll go back to my point. No virtual school can ever be prioritised over and above real school. I don't see that. And as you can probably tell, I'm very open-minded to blue sky thinking, but I don't see that ever happening. Because the one thing that this pandemic's taught me more than ever is that humanity needs humanity. We need face-to-face contact to thrive, to survive in its fullest sense. We need each other, and we need to be there for each other, not through a television screen. We need to be there for each other, next to each other. And that goes back to this whole point about emotional awareness and sensitivity and grace and humanity. These are the key values that we require as a society going forward. And any educational system who doesn't use those as the way to develop is wrong, in my mind. And I think that's probably a good point to leave it as we approach 7 o'clock. I hope that's triggered some thoughts, some interesting ideas and some further conversation. It's been a real pleasure talking with you tonight. And thanks very much for your time. And here's to the end of COVID-19 and getting back to some sort of normal school environment. Thanks so much. Have a good evening.